morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's good to see you all. Carol, thank you for hosting this morning. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We're just making our way into chapter 5, and I'll go ahead and do the screen share, and we'll proceed as always. All right. So, Benum Christ in it, I greet Christ in you and welcome you back to the Peace Chapel this morning. The opening prayer today comes from Brendan O'Malley in a book, Lord of Creation, that I found and thought was actually quite lovely. So let us take a moment and pray. O thou full of compassion, I commit and commend myself unto thee, in whom I am and live and know. Be thou the goal of my pilgrimage and my rest by the way. Let my soul take refuge from the crowding turmoil of worldly thoughts beneath the shadow of thy wings. And let my heart, this sea of restless waves, find peace in thee, O God. Amen. Okay. So our first reading, for those of you following the book, will pick up on page 138. And just let me clear my pictures here. All right. So the location of the cell does not matter. It is only a doorway to the spiritual cell you carry in the little space of your own heart. If your circumstances do not permit you a stable place to return, there is nothing to prevent you from entering the interior cell of your heart, even in the midst of daily life. Saint Francis de Sales instructed, always remember to retire at various times into the solitude of your own heart, even while outwardly engaged in discussions or transactions with others. This mental solitude cannot be violated by the many people who surround you, since they are not standing around your heart, but only around your body. Your heart remains alone in the presence of God. Saint Francis of Assisi, among the most beloved contemplatives of the Church, did not himself live in a monastery, but famously declared, "The world is my cloister, my body is my cell, and my soul is the hermit within." The expansive sense of the world as one's cell, the arena of divine encounter, assumes that true solitude need not be sought out, but is something we carry with us in our bodies, even as we engage the world around us. For Christians living in mainstream society, the relationship between solitary prayer and socially engaged action is central to our understanding of contemplative discipleship. This is because contemplative discipleship is not merely the result or outcome or flowering of a life of prayer, but is its very embodiment. It is not simply that meditation gives rise to action or occurs alongside it, but that prayer and action mutually interpenetrate one another. We might speak at once of prayerful action and action shot through with prayer. The disciples whom Jesus taught to enter daily solitude and pray in secret were the same disciples sent out into the world 2 by 2. Let us pray. Carol, we're still recording. Okay. So our next reading spans 138 to 39, if you're following in the book. Through the cultivation of interior silence, Christ transforms us into salt of the earth and light of the world. In his darkest hour, he implores the apostles, stay awake, praying at all times for the strength to survive all that is going to happen, to stand before the Son of Man. In Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, he writes, always be joyful, pray without ceasing, and for all things give thanks. This is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus. And again in Colossians 4:2, be persevering in your prayers and be thankful as you stay awake to pray. The life of a Christian is a life of incessant prayer, joyfulness, and wakefulness. A wakefulness that cultivates interior serenity and gratitude, even in the midst of one's going out into the world. Thus, the vocation to pray without ceasing is not an appeal to say prayers without ceasing, but rather to embody prayer in all we do. It is less about saying grace and more about eating gracefully, eating thankfully. It is less about what one experiences in the solitude of meditation than it is about how solitary prayer expands into one's entire life, one's whole existence, much like the ripple effect of dropping a stone into a pond. Our actions radiate outward from the ground of our being. This is the action that arises not from the thoughts and judgments of our mind, but from the silence of compassion that we embody. We do not go forth from our solitude to serve the world, but serve the world by including those around us in its circumference. This intersection between prayerful solitude and compassionate engagement in the world is something we might call contemplative discipleship, and is the theme of this chapter. So our closing prayer. Dear God, be with me as I walk your paths in places I sometimes do not want to go. Be with me as I say goodbye to those I want to stay with. Be with me as I leave the gift so newly given and hardly seen. Be with me, Lord, as I try, sometimes sadly, to walk your way. Amen. So good morning once again. It's good to see you all. As always, so we're moving now into the opening pages of the 5th chapter and the final chapter of the book. And as always, I invite your questions or thoughts as we go. Yeah. Good morning, Catherine. Hi. Welcome home. Catherine, you're still muted. You just want to unmute there.
Thank you. A little rusty here. It's very good to be back. And it's amazing to me how often the things that you wrote so long ago are so present to me, so perfectly appropriate to me right in this moment. And I wanted to particularly call up the paragraph that was written by St. Francis de Sales. Always remember to retire at various times into the solitude of your own heart, even while outwardly engaged in discussions or transactions with others. This mental solitude cannot be violated by the many people who surround you, since they are not standing around your heart, but only around your body. Your heart remains alone in the presence of God. And I'd love it if you could speak a little more about that, because that's exactly what I've been needing.
Yeah, I think Francis de Sales, really understood that on some level, the trappings, if we want to call it that, that are often associated with the contemplative life, while helpful, by which I mean a physical place in which we might retire, a place that becomes familiar to us, a posture of prayer that tells our body this is what we're doing now. We're quieting ourselves. That all of those externals, which are certainly important, are more ancillary than central to the contemplative life. Ultimately, that what they're aiming toward is not an end in themselves, but exactly what he sort of describes there, which is that capacity to learn what it is to stay and remain and just to remain grounded in that amidst the commitments and distractions and service that we offer throughout the world. And as I mentioned, even in our last session together, I think often we model or we imagine that being a contemplative in the world is that movement between going into a physical cell and then returning to the world, into the physical cell or prayer space or prayer corner or whatever you want to call that, and then out into the world. But the challenge or the sort of vision that Francis holds out, as well as many others, is that movement is not necessary, that the cultivation of a contemplative life is to learn how to always remain in that cell, as he beautifully describes there, so that all that we do is coming out of that place. And I urge, patience with ourselves as we learn how to do this. We can easily be T-boned, as it were, sideswiped and sort of thrown off course by tragedy or conflict or various things that can be, can make that a very difficult thing to hold on to. But to become more aware of it as we work through whatever is engaging us in the world is to realize we're inviting others into that space rather than needing to leave that space in order to serve others. And of course, what I mean by that is the space of the heart that he's talking about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, for raising that up. I appreciate that. Patty, please.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I agree with Catherine. This whole reading is very much speaking to me right now. But I want to make a comment. I think I've mentioned I'm going into to do prison ministry, and what I'm doing is I'm bringing in centering prayer. Mm-hmm. And this is a powerful paragraph for inmates because they don't have much silence. Mm. And to be able to help them realize, and not only my voice, but to bring in somebody like St. Francis to be able to read this paragraph to them and to know what they're doing in the midst of all that noise and out in the yard or in the cafeteria, that they can still have that experience. Mm-hmm. And also further down, you talked about, or St. Francis talks about carrying this with us. And I was so glad to read that, because sometimes when I'm walking in my neighborhood and somebody stops me to talk to me and I'm thinking, oh, I got to get home. I got so much to do. And, I just make a clumsy prayer to God and say, please just let me be centered in you and listen to this friend, because they might have something important for me, as well as I might be able to help them in whatever they're experiencing. So thank you for those words, Father.
Thank you, Patty. Just a couple of comments, one for each of the scenarios you just raised. It's also I suppose a question in prison ministry you could ask what is the difference between a prison cell and the cell of a hermit? And so how does an individual who's required to remain in a prison cell find through practice that cell becomes a place of transformation and not merely confinement? I think in prison ministry, to be able to ask how that cell becomes that place where they go into that center. And obviously they're required to do that by law because of whatever the crime committed and whatever the sort of punishment being enacted for that. But is it possible that one can transform that? Sort of like when we talked about traffic light asceticism, we can stop at the red light because we're required, and we should stop because we're required. But can we take that moment of stopping at the traffic light and transform that into a moment of prayer and meditation, where the automobile, in a sense, becomes our little cell for the minute or two we're waiting? So just to point that out, that there is a going in and out of a cell for these prison folks that you'll be dealing with, and that there's maybe a way of reframing that to some degree. The other thing, in terms of just being attentive to that friend who stops you when you have a different agenda, we're going to talk about this later in the chapter when we explore Meister Eckart's interpretation of Mary and Martha, and I've alluded to that before in this venue. But really, he extols not Mary but Martha, which is sort of contrary to how most had interpreted it up until then. But that he really says that Martha understands that sometimes we have to let go of our own agenda, even when that agenda is to sit at the feet of the Lord in prayer and to serve the guest in our midst who is Christ, or the Christ whom we pass in the street who needs us for that moment or wants to talk with us. And so there is a very beautiful invitation in that, of putting aside my goals, my agenda, even maybe, I'm going home to meditate. I'm going to put that aside to be present, to love as love demands in the moment. And that is really what the contemplative is ultimately called to, that radical detachment, even sometimes from the very things that help ground us or center us or cultivate the prayer itself. Right. So there's a nimbleness required of us as we negotiate, not avoidance of prayer, but detachment from meditation in order to be prayer for someone else. That makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for
Of course.
just emphasizing all that, because that is what is important. I love what you just said about, I just tried to write it down, but I wanted to listen to you, so I didn't get it. But like, being present is what love demands. Something about love demands in the moment of.
Right. It's being what love demands. Right. It's responding to the call of love in a given moment.
Yeah.
And to allow and to be detached enough to practice that virtue of detachment, so central to the contemplative life, that allows us to be present, even though it's not what we had planned. And if I said it better before, it's being recorded, so we can go back.
Okay. But you know what? It's so true, because when I've done that, God takes care of you, because whatever I was thinking was so important to get back to, that I think, oh my gosh, I don't have 10 minutes to listen. But when I get back, it just goes so much smoother. I you know what I mean? I mean, it's just like, God's going to take care of you. Just do what God asks of you in this moment. And he's going to, if that's really all important, God's going to help you get that done also.
Amen
So
to that.
I
Thank
truly
you.
believe that. Yeah.
Thank you, Patty. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Sue, good to see you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. There are a couple of words that really stand out for me in this passage, and one is wakefulness. What is it? That sense of what does it really mean to be awake, and the connection with embodiment. That learn for me, it's learning to get out of my head and really learn to listen to my body and be aware of kind of the messages that my body is giving me. And then how that you also you used the word container. And so one of the things that for me right now in part of my journey is that working to build that container, to kind of develop that capacity to hold that stance of wakefulness, to keep, because I have been studying Cynthia Bourgeault, that sense of three-centered awareness, that your mind, your heart, and your body are all in sync, and how important that is, to this ability to be present, to be, to pray always. So I just wanted to, to comment on that, and I don't know if you have more more that you could elaborate on that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Sue. I think one of the quintessential sort of or paradigmatic stories we see within the Gospels is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he keeps imploring his disciples to stay awake and pray. And I think there's aside from the historicity of that, there's the metaphorical value of that, which is that when we are confronted with conflict or persecution or opposition, we can easily fall asleep. We can easily forget and untether from these practices that help to keep us grounded and Christ-like, and become more reactive, become more combative, which I know in myself all too well. And so how do we? So I think falling asleep in that sense doesn't mean only literally falling asleep, but forgetting to be awake in spirit, if you want to say, or to, right? So that the falling asleep means we sort of resort to more conflictual or combative methods to overcome opposition, persecution, and so on, rather than to sort of stay awake, right? To keep that vigilance in heart and in body. To come back to Catherine's, raising up of Francis de Sales comment, they don't surround your heart, they surround your body. Your heart remains that beautiful place, even drawing on the prayer from this morning, under the shadow of his wings, as it were. So there is a certain protective quality, if you want to say, within that shadow, that we can retreat to interiorly rather than become outwardly combative, and to hold that place of serenity, even amidst opposition and challenge and so on, or difficulties. So I just would want to point out that when we're reading stories, for example, like the disciples or apostles falling asleep in Gethsemane, aside from what it is as a story, to ask what is the metaphorical value of this, or the allegorical value for the spiritual life, and what does in this case falling asleep means? It doesn't necessarily mean a literal falling asleep, but a forgetfulness of being of coming out of that place of wakeful attentiveness that is the inner hermitage.
Yeah, that sense of being fully conscious, having everything working. Yeah, thank you.
Right, of course. Thanks, Mary Sue. Hey there, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning, Father Vincent. So, like Patty, I was very moved by the Francis of Assisi image. And just meditating on that is kind of almost a poetic image. I just love the idea that it takes something we conceive of spatially, this idea of the monastery, the hermitage, and it gives it a temporal dimension. It moves through time. It's like the walking monastery, and that's just very helpful to me. And it also brought to mind something from last week, a term that I kind of wanted to comment on, but couldn't quite find the words. But
Sure.
In your book, the idea of living into our deification, and there's this kind of forward movement with the ambulatory monastery, and also, and just thinking what you were saying before about sometimes we can be paralyzed by the passage back and forth between prayer and action, and this becomes just one forward motion.
Right.
And then two quick points that brought to mind two kind of quotes as I was meditating. One was from the poet John Keats. He said, "I believe the imagination is my monastery, and I am its monk," which I like this idea of kind of he's the scribe of his imagination. And another quote from another poet and actual monk was from Thomas Merton. And I don't know if this might be helpful, but it's helped me a bit, so maybe I could offer it.
Sure.
It's from his correspondence to Rosemary Radford Ruther, the theologian. And he just writes, "Being a hermit seems to me trying to be a very particular and special kind of artificial man. Whereas for me, what it means is being nothing but man, or nothing but a mere man reduced to his simple condition as man. That is to say, as a non-monk even, a non-layman, a non-categorized man, a plain simple man, not as an ideal state or condition of, quote, striving for spiritual perfection, but a reduction to the bare condition of man as a starting point where everything has to begin, incomplete and insufficient in the sense of being outside social cadres, but then entering into these in a free and tentative way and an exploratory way to establish new and simple relationships. And I just like this idea that he's reduced to the base state of the monastery of the heart, clears away all the detritus, no labels, nothing, and then re-enters. That quote really, when I read it, it was like he was speaking right to me. So I thought that would offer, if others would find that helpful.
Yeah, Michael, thank you for sharing that. It is beautiful. As you might know, our mutual friend Jonathan Montaldo talks about, who's a big Merton scholar, and he talks about the early life of Merton, particularly when he enters the monastery. And there's a lot of photographs of Merton with his cowl and kneeling in perfect accord and serenity, with his hood and all that and everything. His garments are perfectly sort of laid around him. And he talks about that as the patina of holiness, right? That he says Merton knew full well when those pictures were being taken, that there was a projection there, a certain theatrical quality to those. And what you're reading is what happens when that patina dissolves, when that patina is seen for what it is. And, I think it was Merton who says, you become a monk when you enter the monastery, what he originally calls the four walls of my newfound freedom, as he originally refers to it, I think, in Seven Story Mountain. But really, later he'll say, it really takes like some 20 years to become a monk once you enter, because you have to let go of that patina. You have to let go of even the identity of being a monk or a hermit or a contemplative, as it were. And I think you're reading from a much more mature Merton at this point, who has been through that whole thing, right? So I really appreciate your kind of bringing that out. I think the quality of religious trappings, even for lay people, has a certain value to them. I think it's John of the Cross who speaks about, this question, like, when can you see farther, in the daytime or at night? And of course, the implicit sort of reaction is, well, I can see farther in the daytime. But what he comes around to saying is, well, actually, it's after the sun sets that the stars that have been blocked by its brilliance are now visible, and you can actually see much farther into the Milky Way, say, into space, because the sun has set. And his point is to suggest that for most of us, there's a period of time where that sun guides our spiritual journeys. And that includes all of the trappings and the rituals and the garments and all of these things. And so they serve a purpose, they light the way. But for the real spiritual seeker, you reach a point when you come into what, John of the Cross and others would now call the dark night. And while you feel lost, while you feel blind, if you just sit long enough without the trappings and without the guidance and without all the ancillary sort of qualities or the exoteric qualities of religion, what you come to is this capacity to see much, much farther. Now, the sun essentially will come up again, and you re-engage the trappings and you attend the liturgical and ritual practices, but you do it in a very different way. You do it in a way that allows them to sort of serve or be conduits or medium of that deeper journey, not an end in themselves. And so that patina does ultimately need to dissolve. But I think, in fairness, it also needs to be held on to for a while in our youthful stages of the spiritual life. It does serve a purpose. I don't want to, demonize it, but then at some point you can take it or leave it, right? Because you're beyond it, and there's a sense in which you see it for what it is, as a tool and not an end in itself.
Yeah, beautifully put. I never heard that quote from John of the Cross, but that's lovely. Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, I was so struck by that. I think it's in his Ascent to Mount Carmel, if I'm not mistaken. But it's quite a beautiful, and I think actually I first encountered it through Merton, who was quoting John of the Cross so many years ago. I don't recall the thread there, but I believe it goes back to John of the Cross. So it's beautiful. And I think it applies to all of us, whether we're lay or monastics, those of us in the world, and which of course I'm including myself in this, I'm not a monastic, but also those who are in the monastery, there's all kinds of ways we can cling to the trappings of our religion, but at some point the spiritual journey does ask us to relinquish those and then return in a whole new way.
Definitely. Yeah, it's moving through that dialectic between the two poles is keep narrowing the focus. So thank you for that.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a final comment, and I'll say, to Michael, but to all of us, this what Michael raised is this idea of that I was speaking about last time, that we live into our deification, that kind of forward movement. What I'm trying to suggest is two things in that very sort of terse line. Is that what the case I try to make throughout the book is that it is the incarnation that deifies us, nothing that we do of our own accord. So deification is the grace of God become human, and therefore humanity being partaking in the divine nature, to use the biblical citation. So that to live into it or to move into it is, on the one hand, acknowledging it's a fait accompli, it's already done. We are deified. But to come back to the earlier comments, to move into it is to awaken to the reality that is already there, not to create it or establish it or make it happen, but to accept that by grace we are deified, and then to keep moving into the reality of that through a spiritual process of awakening to that. And that's, I don't know if Michael, you took that from what I was saying, but that was one of the
No, I appreciate that elaboration, because that helps. That gives even more. I think I was conceiving of it so my own forward motion in a way, and I wasn't thinking about it's coming from the other direction actually. And I just have to live. I just have to live where I am, and it's going to come anyway. So
right,
yeah,
to wake up. And this, I think, is what Merton is coming to: just to be who I am without all those categories. And there we are. Right.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. Paula, please.
I am commenting or talking about the description of pray without ceasing on page 139, and how much that means to me to read that description and to hear those words. So I took care of my mom. She lived in our home for about 4 years, from about 2009 to 2013. And her age was 94 to 98. And she died here in our home. So almost 4 years. And it was a hard time in a number of ways, and a struggle and a graced time. Painful, really painful at times. And there was lots of prayer that accompanied it, and inner work, an incredible amount of inner work. But there was one moment when in just like in a flash, I had this knowing that my life was prayer. And it was just like, my life is prayer. And I knew it. But I felt it, but I didn't have the understanding of your words. So I didn't really understand the way you describe it. But somehow I knew that my life was prayer, and that I was living prayer. And now I read your words, and it's like embodied prayer is what it was. But so much more could be said. So this whole thing of being in the cell of my heart, being in the cell of my being, in the cell of my body. One of the insights I get today is being in my cell doesn't always mean that it's a calm, peaceful place, but that I can be in the cell of my being, even in the midst of the struggle and the pain and the turmoil and the range of emotions that comes with caring for someone that I'm so close to and yet have lived with for so many years, and that I can be in the cell of my being and yet hold so much feeling and emotion, but doesn't mean that afflictive emotions is tearing me away, if that makes sense. And it also, I'm aware, doesn't always mean that I'm embodied prayer, because I'm human, and my humanity, it doesn't mean I'm always awake. So the way you talk about being awake, and yet, what a grace it was to know. I mean, to really know deeply that my life was prayer. And I thank you so much for what you've written and how you're teaching. It means so much to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. That's very heartwarming. And I want to start by just acknowledging you're a very good daughter to have cared for your mother that way. It's beautiful to hear. And I do understand how difficult caretaking can be when someone is failing. And there's all kinds of conflicting emotions and struggles and graces and beauty. I spoke at a funeral many years ago of a friend whose father had Lou Gehrig's for many years, 11 years, which is almost unheard of. It was a very drawn out illness for him. And finally, they removed him from life support as he requested. That once he couldn't communicate, he was communicating for years with eyes and blinking. It was amazing what they had established. But what I talked about in the context of that caretaking was looking at the story of the friends who bring their friend on the mat and lower him through the roof to lower him to Christ, because the crowd wouldn't allow them to reach him and they wanted him to be healed. And I imagined that for all the years they cared for him and for the long journey of carrying him on a mat to Christ, and somebody's toes got stepped on and there were arguments and bickering, and I'm doing more than you're doing, and why aren't you helping as much, and all the things that can go on when we have little bandwidth and we're being pulled and pushed and struggled. But at the end of the day, they were able to release him into the arms of Christ, and that's where his healing comes. And in a sense, at 98, you were finally at that point where your mom could be released into the arms of Christ. And no matter how difficult or how painful that might have been at times, and grace-filled, you were there. You did what you did, and you stuck with it to the end until you could give her to Christ. And there's a tremendous sense of beauty and prayerfulness embodied in that. And this is one of the, points that I really want to continue to make throughout this chapter in this book, that as I mentioned today, it isn't so much about saying prayers. It's about being prayerful. Don't just say grace and then move on. What does it mean to eat thankfully? What does that look like? That's much more important than whispering a few lines before you eat, and then you're eating while still asleep, as it were. What does it mean to eat awake? Eat thankfully. So in this case, what does it mean to pray when you have the daily burden for years to care for a loved one who is ailing and who is failing? And how do you remain present to that person? That is embodied prayer. Whether you're voicing it or whether you're using words to accompany it, don't matter as much as the love that bears it. That's the prayer. And so I'm grateful that something I wrote was able to kind of put words on what you already intuited and were already living, and to help maybe put that into sharper relief. That brings me great comfort to know that. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. And your scripture that you referred to of people carrying a loved one to Jesus, as you said that, I sensed that I did have a support community in different ways,
Right.
That I really needed. And so I sensed that I wasn't carrying my mom. It was the support structure that was carrying both myself and my mom. It's like we both needed to be carried for me to be able to live what I lived. And so that just brings me back to this whole community, like here today, that we gather together in all of our communities, the whole body of Christ in all the communities. It's like carrying each other,
Right.
I am carried, and when I can carry someone else, what a blessing and gift. But thank you for that passage also.
Of course. Thank you, Paula. Hi there, Christine. Morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, but has been spoken of by mystics, that have been such a revelation to me, that came to me in one of my darkest hours, and that is this image of being in the womb of God. For many reasons, prayer being union with God, that is the greatest sensory, visual, physical, spiritual, mental picture that makes me realize, number one, my dependence upon God. Number two, that I'm in the womb, which is the compassion of God. So I'm in this completely love-filled space. So I feel protected, I feel safe, regardless of my situation, if I can keep this image alive within me. And that nothing is my doing, as Paula so beautifully shared with her most loving experience. God is the one. God is the doer. We are so blessed to receive and just go with the flow of that. And so it relieves me of all effort. I don't have to do anything. God is always working in me, no matter what, how terrible I feel or how angry I may be with my little rebellion in the womb. And so also it is the realization of our continued presence and connection with God that we lost in the garden. And so for me, this is living in the garden with God and everyone else, not just the people on this planet, but the whole cosmos. I mean, I started as the little baby within the womb, just me by myself, because I needed that so much. Now it includes the whole cosmos. So I just share that, hoping that it will somehow help other people.
Christine, thank you. And one of the things that comes to mind as you kind of point that out is you see here the parallel or the way in which what we're calling now contemplative discipleship or contemplative engagement in the world, with its potential conflicts or distractions or the various things, that the demands that are being made, how much that parallels the interior journey of meditation itself, of contemplative life. Like, so the interior grappling with logismoi, as the monks would call it, the thoughts or passions that come up, right? These things that distract us. All you have to do, to your point, is just to stay present, right? Externally, those thoughts and distractions are fueled by interactions with other people, conflictual situations, whatever the case may be. So it's the same for both, whether you're in meditation or in contemplative engagement in the world. The point is, all of these things out there are distractions. How do you remain grounded and centered and coming out of that place, that centered place of silence, that centered place of groundedness, that so-called hermitage that we carry? And it's interesting to see that parallel. It really is the same dynamic. The meditation is my own thoughts coming up, engaging the world. It might be somebody else giving me thoughts or telling me things that are hurtful or difficult or whatever, conflictual. But whatever the case may be, the practice is exactly the same. Come back to the center and keep going. Right. And thank you for that. I appreciate your sharing that. So we are just about 10 minutes after the hour. And I'm wondering if there's any other comments or questions someone might have. Otherwise, but maybe I'll introduce the practice for this coming week and a discussion of practice for last week, if anybody took me up on it. But let me make sure I've vetted the questions first. Yeah, hi, Marianne.
Hi there. Sorry, it took a minute to get unmuted. I wanted to comment and appreciate what you shared in the line of your book on how we include others in the circumference when we go out and engage the world. And I've been reflecting on that, and I think Christine's comment really speak well to that. If we can imagine ourselves in the womb, and then she started alone in the womb, but we're really in our awareness and our awakening, we are bringing everyone else into our heart, into our prayer, as we feel ourselves grounded in the womb. And that's just touching me. I wanted to share my appreciation of that, because too many times I think when we're still new to this journey, we can get off the map too quickly and leave all that centeredness in our prayer space and go about our agendas. And it's, I'm just really appreciating hearing that we really bring others into that heart space with us, to be present to others, and to bring that centeredness, and so that action of the spirit can flow through us, and it's not, us leaving our center.
Right.
That presence.
Well, what I appreciate about two things maybe to comment on. It is true, the capacity for each of us to avoid the prayer bench is almost endless in the ways in which our minds will devise reasons why we should wait or pray later or come back to it, or I'm too busy, or not today, or we could probably talk forever about the excuses the creative ways in which our minds distract from the prayer bench. So I want to say that what you're raising is so important, because as we'll see when we look again at Eckart's discussion of Mary and Martha, Martha is the mature contemplative. In other words, she knows what it is to remain faithful to what Mary is doing, so-called sitting at the feet of the Lord, or what we would call, contemplative practice, that sitting on the bench or the cushion, as it were. So one could easily, for example, take what I wrote and just add that to the laundry list of excuses why I shouldn't or don't need to meditate today. And that, of course, would be misreading my intentions there, even though it's an understandable thing. So the idea is, I think it's almost one of the analogies I find helpful, and where the balance is when you look at someone who does pottery, like on a wheel. It takes quite a bit of concerted effort and concentration to center the lump of clay at the center of that wheel. Now, you could take your hands off of that for a short time as that wheel continues to spin, but the slightest anomaly in that lump of clay, the slightest weight difference, is going to eventually begin to take hold, and that thing will start swaying until finally it'll just ultimately fly off the wheel if you didn't come back to that centering, right? So I think a good way to think about it is the returning to that prayer practice of silence is essential as a regular practice. For those of us in the world, more so than those in the monastery who have a much more strict schedule around that, we have to be nimble on the one hand. So we can remove our hands from that clay for a while in order to serve another. And we could get away with that for some time, but eventually we're going to start realizing I'm not acting out of the hermitage anymore. I'm not inviting people into that space. I've left it a long time ago now, and that clay is flying off the wheel. So how do we? So on the one hand, we make a commitment to that regular practice, knowing full well that there are moments when we will have to take our hands off that lump of clay to do what love demands, and then to come back to it again. One might make an analogy of, an athlete. I think there's a saying that, for a really big athlete, one day of training and the athlete, if you miss one day of training, the athlete notices. 2 days of training, the coach notices. 3 days you miss, and everybody notices. So there's a sense in which there is somehow the requirement to stay the course while holding out a lack of rigidity around it when the demand to love a neighbor, as we had talked about earlier, presents itself. Does that make sense? And then what we do is, because we're centered, we can more easily invite somebody into that centered place rather than feel we need to leave it. But if we don't hold that clay down, we're going to find ourselves flying all over the place. At least that's my autobiographical experience of that, which happens repeatedly. So, so it's always the reminder, yep, got to get back to that bench, right? Does
Thanks
that
for
help?
that pottery, image. And I just like this idea of bringing others into our hearts.
Right.
That is a different movement than us going out into the world. It's really about us opening our hearts and inviting more in.
Right, right.
And in many ways, I am blessed in my work because I'm a hospice chaplain. So when I go out to the world, most of my work days, I'm going to people at a very vulnerable position and who really need prayer. I have to continue to stay present and prayerful and invite them into my heart. And yet at the end of the day, I have to leave it all in God's heart, because I could take home much of it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that invitation at the end of the day to go to the cell of your own heart is exactly what we were just talking about. That is the capacity ultimately then to let it all go into Christ, right? To really just recognize that you're handing that over now. Otherwise, it incapacitates you just because you're human and empathetic. Right. So thanks, Marianne. I appreciate those insights there. Hi, Jess. Thank you for your comment earlier.
Good morning. Thank you, Marianne. I really like that you brought that up. And Father, I can obviously very much resonate with that concept of having a difficult time, having a lot of excuses, always
Right.
finding the right one to make you feel better. This topic is just very present right now in my life. It just seems to be coming up about the cell. And I think I mentioned, spending a lot of time right now in different monasteries, and in the monastery that we had just spent with the sisters in Kentucky, my husband came across this book called Pustinia by Catherine de Hoot Doherty, which I guess Merton called the Baroness who had the Harlem House. And it's all, that's what a pustinia is, I guess, from the Russian roots, is a cell for people to come to. And it was just that, a place to be with God and to have this sacred space. And then I think about in her works, like, it was service. It was nothing but service to the poor and letting go of everything that was holding her back from doing that. And the constant struggle that she was encountering. And so now I'm thinking about how does that fit within my life? Because as I mentioned, 2 months ago now, I think we've been on this for a month and a half or so. My husband and I just took on this extreme change in our life. And in your reading today, talking about the pilgrimage, the life being the pilgrimage, we're doing it nomadically. And I'm trying to find within myself, like, what does this pilgrimage mean for me? What is the cell that I have? And because right now, in the way that we're living, we're honestly just surrendering to God. And I don't have a sacred space or a specific spot, because every so often it's going to be a new place, a new space among new people. So I am trying to find, how do I embody that? And the most that I can do is in the works that we do, and we encounter people on the streets. But places that I think of are in my walks. Right now, my husband, I've mentioned him a lot, but he's honestly 100% trying to live the Gospels. And when we walk, whether it's just together or whether it's encountering people, our conversations are about God and opening us to the people we encounter. And so it's just been a really interesting thing to try to reflect, well, where is that space in my cell, and where is the space that I can find? And it turns out to be just in our walks, in our encounters, and in that kind of allowing God to introduce us to the people that we do. And in this nomadic pilgrimage, shall I say, we're forced to be more present. We're forced to step away from this routine that can, at least for me, to can get comfortable, but it's just been a constant, like, okay, take your cell with you, become that cell, and just needing to remind myself of that.
Yeah, Jess, thank you for that. I mean, what you raise is, I think, an important question that we can look at each in our own way. I think sometimes we have a tendency to put on a pedestal a particular person or ideal or notion of what the perfect contemplative is, what that looks like. And then we attempt to emulate that on some level, a quality of serenity or whatever the case may be. And I just want to encourage all of you to reevaluate the notion that there is some contemplative ideal out there, and instead evaluate, what does it mean for me with all of my commitments, all of my gifts, all my limitations, like all my personality traits, all my experiences? What does the contemplative life look like in my own body, in my own life, in my own experience? And while we can certainly point to what are really not even just Christian, but trans-religious kind of, centuries and millennia old sort of building blocks, silence, right? Periods of solitude, all these things, even ascetical practices. Those are going to look very different when they're filtered through each of us. And so start with who you are and not imagine that there's some goal out there, a Merton, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, or a Francis de Sales, or, who am I as a contemplative? What does that mean for me to live into my deification, to awaken to, the dear guest Christ, as Eckhart says, that Martha attends to be present to that? And how does that come, all of these sort of strands or elements come together in a unique way in me? Live into that instead of looking to someone else who is going to define that for you, because you'll never meet that sort of external expectation. So it's a beautiful thing just to see that you're discovering on those walks, you are getting connected to that inner hermitage, that place, that solitude, that sense of presence. That's a beautiful thing. And it's beautiful not only because it's happening, but because you're aware that it's happening. You're aware that you're aware of it, as it were. And so I would ask each of us to consider that. What circumstances, what individuals, what contexts bring me most steadily into that place where I know I'm encountering God, where I really feel that deep down presence, as it were, and how these very broad, almost universal building blocks sort of work their way through who I am. And what will come of that is a deeply unique and particular way of being prayer, of being a contemplative in the world, right? And that's the beauty of it. All right, thank you, Jess, for that. I appreciate your raising that. Okay, let me then call up, in the interest of time, if you'll permit me, I'll call up our guide here and offer contemplative practice for the coming week. And then for those who, if there's any discussion to be had, we can stay for a few minutes to talk about last week's practice. So this is essentially, and maybe this flows beautifully from just what you just raised. What does it look like for you to carry your cell with you, right? To invite others into it rather than leave it in order to serve. What might that look like in your life? In a sense, this is flowing exactly from, my last comments, which I didn't plan. So that's a nice piece right there. So that's the question, right? What does it look like for you? I certainly know in my own life what it is to not act out of the cell of my heart. I know what that looks like. So what transforms, what changes when I'm responding or reacting or engaging from within the cell? Okay, that said, last week's practice, if you'll permit me, reflect on the place you call your cell. This is sort of going back. Where is it? What's in it? And what is sacred about it for you? So here I'm moving. So last week was basically an invitation to talk about the cell of the physical place. Where do you go? Do you have a room, a corner of a room, a bench in a park? What does your cell look like? What is that place that you like to go back to? And then this week's is asking you to look more at the interior cell. So you'll see those two flowing. So looking at this comment or this invitation from last week, anybody want to talk about their cell, what it looks like, why that's important to them? And with that, I'll go ahead and close out of this if I can figure out how to do that. There we are. Okay. All right. Any takers on last week's invitation? What's in your cell? What does it look like? Where is it? My cell is actually right behind me. I can show it to you there if that's visible to you all. It's a corner of a room. Let me see if I can get you a little closer there. See if I can put some light on this. So there's this is an altar I actually had made. And you can see I made them because I'm usually at a prayer bench, which is right down there. I asked the artist to make an alpha and omega shape to the legs. And there's a beautiful piece there that just simply says, I am, going across the A. And that's all made of a fallen oak tree that was very close to my home. It actually crushed an SUV, totally destroyed it. Nobody was injured. Down. And so I said, I want something local. They said, boy, do we have a local tree for you. It fell like 3 blocks from my house. And then I just have some of my more favorite icons up there that have had meaning for me or have been given to me over the years. And that's what it looks like. Dwight, please.
I've got a little corner in my study that is quite similar to yours. And I've got several icons on the wall. Even the perpetual light hanging from one corner. I can't show you now because it's all dark in here. And and I did not lit the candles before, which usually I do, because I'm still recovering from a COVID and still very weak. And my point of bringing this to discussion is that this physical representation of my cell actually helped me to keep the strength of my prayers and kept me on the right track. When in moments I was with no energy for anything, there were days I was completely asthenic, completely anhedonic to do anything. And thanks to this, to that little corner, that space I created, it was a reminding for me that it was a moment, and there was a time and a moment for me to stop and reflect and pray. So may not represent the same meaning for others, but for me, that was a way to remind me that no matter where I go, whenever I come to my study room, it is always there. The light is on and reminding me that Christ is next and it is within me, in fact. So that's what the comment I wanted to add to what you just showed us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dwight. That's very beautiful. First of all, I'm so sorry to hear you're having such a bout with COVID. That's it's terrible. So I'll keep you in prayer on that for a speedy recovery on that. Yeah. And thank you for sort of sharing the description of your space. It's been described that the difference between an idol and an icon is that an idol terminates in itself, where an icon points beyond itself to the reality that it represents. So to have that kind of window to the divine, as they're often called, does really help to ground us and to move us into that deeper presence, or the interior space that goes beyond the trappings, as it were, or the externals, pointing to something far greater. It's beautiful. So thank you. And I'll keep you in prayer, Dwayne.
Thank you.
Of course. David, please.
This is a little different kind of cell that has been important to me, and may sound a little strange, but I'm in a water aerobics class in the morning, and when people leave, for 20 minutes, I simply float on the water. Hands and just float on the water, and just seem to be able, with no symbols, no anything, but just being present and centered, just floating on the water. And so it's become a very important place for me. I mean, some people come in and think I'm dead and all kinds of things, but it's just but there's nothing visual, nothing anything, but it's just like I'm being carried as I just float on the water and am present. And so it's a lovely little gift at this season in my life.
Indeed, that's beautiful. Thank you, David. That's such a nice image. Another David who's been with us for the last couple of years, but has recently passed. Some of you know David Farrell. He would often do that as a sign to me before we would sign off. He would just open his arms, cruciform. He knew he was dealing with a terminal illness, and that was his way of just releasing himself into the arms of Christ. So I always love seeing him do that at the end, the end of these, and I miss that. But your story of just floating there, sort of arms outstretched, reminded me of that beautiful posture. So thank you. Other thoughts? All right, Kathy, please.
I am really grateful for the opportunity to reflect on my prayer space. Mine is very comes from my Buddhist days. So I sit on a Tibetan Buddhist cushion, which is a little more elevated than most for Buddhist practices. And so my knees are then resting on the meditation mat, which is pretty cushioned. But I really love the 3-point groundedness of that posture. And by reflecting on this week, it really came to me how important for me that 3-pointed groundedness is, because I so easily get lost and distracted. I think at this point in my contemplative journey, there's just a lot more resistance. And so the distractions have been much more frequent. And I face it's in my bedroom where I always sit in the same place. So I'm facing a very white closet door. So it's sort of almost Zen in a way. And I've got my favorite meditation book, which is 365 Meditations by Henry Nouwen, who really speaks to my heart. And then a prayer bracelet that a member of our Saturday group here gave to me, which again is just very special. So I feel, at least I've set up this cocoon around me, even though my mind, like I said, keeps getting distracted. I'm still very grounded with all of those things, and have that openness of the blank wall in front of me. Even though my eyes are closed, it's very important that I also have this point that offers the invitation to fully open.
Thank you, Kathy. You know, one of the things that comes to me as you share that, and I appreciate the details around that, is how much I think repetition, routine, familiarity is important for a meditative practice. To know that when I sit in that particular corner on that particular bench before those particular icons, there's like a body memory thing that goes on, as I'm sure you're aware. And having that stability, this is why I think for monastics, stability was so important, that, where you really commit to a particular monastery. There is a sense in which it, just knowing that I go to that place helps to bring me to that place through sheer memory. My pup Forrest, who is about to turn 7 next month, I realized as he's moving along in life, really likes routine. And I realized that I do too, that there's a sense in which I'm recognizing in him my own patterns as I'm getting old, that there's a degree to which having a certain pattern or ritual or stability does help bring you to the place of, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing now. And your body can ease into it. So all of those little accoutrements, as we might call them, are really helpful in bringing our body there. And your talk about cushions as a final comment, very important that the body is comfortable. Maybe not lazy boy comfortable because it's too easy to fall asleep, but comfortable enough where you don't have to think about your body, where you're not feeling aches or pains or pressure points and so forth. So find a place that is comfortable, and that really helps your body to relax into the space. All right. Okay. And then final comment, Sue, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. In a way, I'm going to say something that's completely the opposite to what you just said, because my life for nearly 20 years now has been living in so many different places. But I can't remember even how it started, but I always travel with my yoga mat, and I travel with an image of Jesus, and I travel with a couple of little things that people have given me, like a little figure of someone meditating, a little angel, and I usually have a shawl. So whenever I land somewhere new, I normally look for a corner, and I make a little space, and I always have my yoga mat then sort of going into that corner. So I do my yoga practice in the morning, and for me, it becomes a space of prayer. So I'm doing things with the body, but in my mind, I'm in prayer, and I also listen to a daily lesson from A Course in Miracles, and I was just remembering with gratitude. Many years ago, I was with someone and we were sharing a room, a hotel room. I wasn't in a spiritual community, and we had room service one day, and in this hotel in India, and the person that came in, I just noticed they really took care to walk around the space that I'd created and didn't step on it in any way, and I was so touched by that. And anyway, it just came to my mind, and I felt to share, especially when I was hearing Jess speaking about being in different places and how to have a space like that, a cell space. And yeah, Jesus is quite light if it's just on an image on a piece of paper and you put him in your suitcase and take him to the next place. So that's great.
It strikes me, Sue, on some level that the very specific items that you're referring to is a way of creating routine, familiarity, yes. Right? Because you are traveling or moving a lot. That doesn't surprise me at all. To have this image and not just a corner of a hotel room, but this icon or this statue, because it kind of becomes a traveling hermitage on some level. Yeah.
And sometimes the images change if I'm
sure.
If I'm drawn to a particular image, and especially, so sometimes the images change, but I'm just so grateful for it.
Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful commitment. Thank you. So thank you all. I really appreciate all of your comments and questions today. Very rich and thoughtful, as always. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. I plan to be here, and hope to see you then. So as we go this morning, I send you in the love of Christ. I send you with the deep grace to call you to that place of solitude, to call you to that place of silence. I pray for you the deep grace to hold that nimbly, to know what it means to love as love demands in every moment. I pray you the grace to know what it means to embody prayer, to carry the hermitage in your heart and invite all whom you encounter into that sacred space. And I pray you my blessing in the name of the Three in One and One in Three. Amen.